of a court musician of the 18th century, dressed in waistcoat, with lace at his fingertips, and with a high powdered wig, the chances are you think first of Franz Joseph Haydn, or Papa Haydn as he liked to be called. But lest you think that Haydn started out as a court musician, let's start at the beginning. His father's name was Matthias, and his mother's was Maria. Joseph was born in a little Austrian town of Rohrau, near the Hungarian border. His father was a skilled carriage maker in the service of Count Harrach. His mother, in fact, had once been a cook in the Count's castle, and from her Joseph was to inherit a love of good cooking which was to be with him all his life. When he was old enough to go to school, Joseph was sent to a cousin's school in Hainburg, some distance away, because there was no school in Rohrau. This cousin of Haydn's was a nice enough person, but a bad teacher. Joseph never really learned his ABCs too well, and in fact never was able to write or read as well as he should have. But this cousin did teach Haydn one thing, and that was to love good music. He quickly learned to play the violin and the harpsichord, and in fact picked up a lot of musical knowledge all by himself. One time he had to substitute for a drummer, and poor Joseph had never played the drum, so he got himself a flour tub, stretched a cloth across it, and banged away for practice. At the performance, with a real drum, he was splendid. One bright day, a Kapellmeister, or director of music from Vienna, was in town to recruit singers for Vienna's famous St. Stephen's Cathedral. He heard Haydn singing in a choir and immediately sent for him. The boy was very nervous when the director asked him to sing. After one song, Haydn, who as usual was hungry, saw a big plate of luscious black cherries sitting on the table. He stared at the fruit. The director saw this and said, "Joseph, if you'll sing a trill for me, I'll give you a handful of cherries." Joseph had never sung a trill before, but in a minute had his mouth full of cherries and was well on his way to Vienna. St. Stephen's was, and indeed still is, the greatest landmark in Vienna. To be a choir boy there was the hope of many an Austrian lad. And St. Stephen's was about all he was to see of Vienna for 9 long years. In the choir house, he was taught Latin, reading, arithmetic, religion, and, of course, music. It wasn't easy work by any means. After lessons, there were services to sing, masses, or maybe funerals. On rare occasions, they'd go to the home of a prince or maybe a baron. Joseph liked that because there he'd have plenty to eat. Haydn's mind wasn't really on his studies, though. He was always into mischief. One day, he was outside the palace of the emperor and empress and saw a ladder resting against the wall. Up Joseph went. But no less a person than the empress herself, Maria Theresa, saw the bad boy and ordered him soundly spanked. Years later, when Haydn was to know the empress, he reminded her of the spanking. "Well," remarked Her Majesty, "I'm glad to see that it has done you some good." A few years after this prank, Haydn made the mistake of cutting off the pigtail of the boy who sat in front of him in class. This was too much, and he was expelled from school. His only possessions were 3 shirts and 2 music books. At that time, he was 19 years old. After many amusing adventures, including writing an opera called The Crooked Devil for a charlatan, living in the streets, and playing violin for men serenading their sweethearts, Joseph got tired of starving. He was lucky enough, finally, to get a position with a teacher named Niccolo Porpora. This time there was no more joking, anyhow, not for the moment. Haydn studied very hard. He had to work very hard, too, shining old Porpora's shoes, running errands, copying music. In fact, he worked 16 hours a day. Haydn learned a lot from cranky old Porpora, enough, in fact, to get himself a position with a great Bohemian aristocrat named Count Maximilian Morzin. It wasn't a very good position, but it apparently represented some security for Joseph, for he promptly set out to get himself married. Unfortunately, it wasn't until after the marriage that Haydn found that his bride didn't like music. In fact, she used to use his manuscripts for hair curlers. By this time, Haydn had a considerable reputation. It was shortly after his marriage that he was approached by none other than Prince Paul Anton Esterházy. What a fine chance for him! The Esterházys were one of the great European families and genuinely loved music. Haydn immediately entered into their service. The terms of the contract Haydn had to sign were very strict by our standards. Haydn had to promise to behave himself, compose any music that he should be ordered to compose, lead the orchestra and chorus, and promise to stay with the prince for 3 years. But the salary was handsome, and Haydn wanted a chance to prove himself as a composer. Perhaps we should mention that Haydn was no wonder child like Mozart or Schubert. In fact, here he was, 29, and had yet to compose any really great music. By that age, Mozart and Schubert were approaching the end of their lives and had written much fine music. Haydn was to live to the age of 77. In that time, he was to compose 104 symphonies, 12 masses, 44 piano sonatas, 83 string quartets, 19 operas, 5 oratorios, and other pieces past count. Haydn simply was a slow starter. But once installed as assistant conductor at the Esterházy estates at Eisenstadt, he lived for work. He was a great experimenter. When he began to compose, he found the symphony little more than an unimportant musical form. He was to leave it forever impressed with his character. That is why Haydn is often called the father of the symphony. It wasn't long before Haydn found himself head of the Esterházy Orchestra. Prince Anton had died, and his brother Nicholas the Magnificent he was called, became Haydn's employer. He loved music even more than his brother, and music flowed through Eisenstadt. Haydn was always experimenting. The prince loved an old stringed instrument you never hear nowadays called a baritone. So Haydn composed 125 divertimenti for him. Someone made a musical clock, and nothing would do but that Papa Haydn should write the music for it. Even when he was in his 60s, he insisted on experimentation. A man in Vienna invented a keyed trumpet, so naturally Haydn wrote him a concerto. He was an ingenious little man. Sometimes he had to be a diplomat too. For instance, during one long hot summer, the musicians from the orchestra came to Haydn one day and said, "Look, Papa, we're tired of playing. We haven't seen our families for a long time. Can't you help us get leave to go home?" Haydn promised to see what he could do. Next evening, as usual, the prince and all his court came to a concert. The last work, as usual, was a symphony. But what an unusual symphony! The first three movements were all right, and the fourth started out as usual, but suddenly a horn player put down his instrument, blew out his candle, and left. Then a bassoon player did the same. Then another horn player and an oboist. Then a cello, a double bass, and at last only two violins were playing. Haydn acted as if nothing were out of the ordinary. Finally, the two violinists blew out their candles. Haydn laid down his baton and started to tiptoe out too. But the prince called to him, "My dear Haydn, I understand perfectly. Tomorrow we leave for home."